our next part of Unit 3. Today we're going to be talking about medieval Islamic art. So I put an asterisk here to indicate that this will be one of possibly around 3 lectures that we have about Islamic art in general. However, we're not going to cover the other 2 lectures of Islamic art until next semester when we're covering Western and Central Asia. This is just the way that the AP curriculum divides up Islamic art. So that's just a memo. So don't forget all of the words, especially stuff pertaining to mosque architecture and Islam itself as a world religion, because it will come up again in the curriculum. So a lot of students, especially in the Western world, don't have a foundational understanding of what Islam is about. And unfortunately, due to some more recent history that pertains to the United States relationship with people that practice Islam, unfortunately, there's a lot of misconceptions about Islam as a whole. So a couple of things that you need to know is that Allah, who is God, basically in Islam, is the exact same God that is worshipped in Judaism and Christianity. The same God. All right? Another thing. So the Prophet Muhammad was basically said to have been visited by the Archangel Gabriel. So this is the same archangel that visited Mary and basically told her that she was pregnant with Jesus Christ. So the Prophet Muhammad was in Mecca at this time, and Mecca is the holiest city in Islam. When we get to the next semester, we're going to talk about the Kaaba, which is this massive monument in Mecca. So Gabriel basically told Muhammad that he had been entered into the ranks of the biblical prophets, so the likes of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus Christ. So he is the principal prophet in the Islam religion. So there's 5 pillars to Islam that you might have covered in your world history classes. These are some very basic tenets that you should know when we talk about Islam. So basically, there is this notion that this is a monotheistic religion. Allah is worshipped and Muhammad is his messenger. There's also Salah, which is this prayer that is offered 5 times a day. So Muslims will frequently carry a prayer rug around with them, and they, at specific times of the day, will point their rug towards Mecca and pray. So that's 5 times a day. That's one of the pillars of Islam. The other is charity. And then there's also the Hajj, which is pilgrimage. So pilgrimage is basically if you are financially and physically able to do so during your lifetime, you are asked to go to the house of Allah at Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, which was mentioned here. There's also the month of Ramadan, which asks for practitioners of Islam to fast during the daytime. Another thing that you should remember is that the Quran, sometimes spelled Koran, is the recitation, essentially. That's what Quran translates to. It's the holy book of Islam. So it's kind of like what the Torah is in Judaism or the Bible is in Christianity. So you'll notice that I do not have pictures of the Prophet Muhammad or Allah here. What is represented here instead is calligraphy. So this is Kufic script, which is one of the forms of Islamic calligraphy. One of the tenets of Islam is a ban on representational images of Allah or God and the Prophet Muhammad. So this is seen as idolatry. So you might recall when we covered the Byzantine Empire that there was the iconoclastic controversy. A lot of religious officials saw these images of Jesus Christ and God as being idols, and people would worship the objects rather than worship the people. So this is something that we see a lot in Islam, especially in non-secular imagery and more religious imagery. You are not seeing images of Allah and you're not seeing images of the Prophet Muhammad. So there's a lot of controversy. A lot of political cartoonists don't really understand this, and they will actually draw the Prophet Muhammad as a person in a political cartoon, and it results in a lot of conflict and anger and misunderstanding. So that's why you don't see pictures of the Prophet Muhammad or Allah. Whereas you see a lot of prophets in Christian art, and you'll also see images of Jesus Christ in Christian art. So in terms of history, Mecca is right here on the map. So Islam basically spread from the Arabian Peninsula, what is now Saudi Arabia, and spread along this eastern-western axis, more or less. So in the east, we had travel along the Silk Road. So what ends up happening in a lot of these areas is that there's local traditions that have already been established in a lot of these regions, and this Islamic influence is then going in and further influencing the art. So you see a lot of like hybridized artwork in this region. We also see Islam moving west, and interestingly, we see Islam spreading through North Africa. So Constantinople was kind of a stronghold for like the Christian religion until 1453, when it, of course, was taken over by the Ottoman Empire and turned over to the Mughals. Or sorry, yeah, it was turned over to the Ottoman Empire, and Constantinople was then changed to Istanbul. But they weren't really able to go through this strait right here and infiltrate Western Europe this way, so they just took the back route through Northern Africa, and they ended up conquering lots of parts of Spain. So this is why in Spain today you see lots of elements of Islamic influence, especially in art and architecture in Spain. There's also actually influences of Arabic in the Spanish language as well. So there's a term in Spanish called ojalá, which basically translates to God willing. So you'll notice that in ojalá, there is the word Allah in there, which you'll remember is the God in Islam. So there's lots of little kind of like phonetic clues in the language that still persist to this day. So the Islamic dynasties were called caliphates. So a lot of these military campaigns that were coming out of the Arabian Peninsula were heralded by these caliphates. So these rich and powerful people who would basically establish these massive kingdoms and expand their territory in these areas. So in the mid-1200s, of course, we had other people coming in from Eastern Asia, including the Mongols, that were also coming in and putting their own influence into a lot of these areas. So what ended up happening is that you saw a more or less of a split into Eastern and Western regions of Islamic art. So one of the things I want to preface this lecture with is that there's not really a canonized type of Islamic art. There's no really one rule that unifies all artwork that is designated as Islamic, quote unquote, except for the shared faith of the artist or artists and or the patron or patrons. So either the artist is Muslim or the patrons are Muslim in most cases. What you'll also notice too is that the artwork that has a more secular purpose, so it's not religious, is going to look a little bit different than the artwork that has a religious purpose. You'll recall from this previous slide that there's a prohibition on images that depict the Prophet Muhammad and Allah. So this prohibition actually expands to pretty much all sentient beings in a lot of factions of Islam. So if you actually walk into a mosque, you won't see any representational imagery of humans or what Muslims consider like higher beings, so animals that are like considered more intelligent. What you'll see instead are lots of plant motifs and geometric designs. So this is kind of the way that they're compensating for like this prohibition on certain kinds of imagery, is that they're filling it in with something else. So what you'll typically see in secular work is that there's a little bit less of a prohibition. You'll actually see figure work in images that are not intended for worship. Sometimes it depends on the region. Again, this is such a huge diaspora coming out of just like the small region of the Arabian Peninsula that there's going to be a lot of different interpretations of this rule and a lot of different like regional variations in terms of what is deemed okay and what is not. So in terms of history, again, there's going to be a lot of stuff today that we cover in Spain because a lot of this area was occupied by Muslim caliphates during the medieval period. So before that, of course, you'll remember that Western Europe had pretty much descended into chaos after the fall of the Roman Empire. The East was basically the Byzantine Empire, and then the West was basically like all of these warring tribes and barbarians that were taking over these various regions. You'll remember that in Italy we had the Goths. We had the Visigoths in Spain as well. So Spain in particular was occupied by this group called the Moors or the Moros, uh, and they are influencing a lot of the artwork and architecture in Spain even to this day. So Islam also spread into Turkey, modern day Turkey, and eventually reached Constantinople. And as I mentioned, converted Constantinople into Istanbul and established this as a new like important center. Again, this is a really strategic location in the Mediterranean that is used primarily for trade as well as these massive urban centers. So this is why the Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, is that the Muslims basically came in and they conquered this area. So to this day, Turkey is still considered a part of the Islamic diaspora. So, a couple of things. I know I've been overloading you all with some architecture terms. This should be the bulk of it for the unit. I have a couple of other words sprinkled throughout the rest of Unit 3, but it shouldn't be too bad after this. So there's a couple of words that you should know when we're talking about mosques. So a mosque, for one thing, is something that you should understand. So a mosque is a place of worship for Muslims, people who practice Islam. So it's basically the equivalent of a synagogue in Judaism or a church in Christianity. So, a couple of things. When you enter a mosque, you will sometimes find a courtyard or a san. It depends on the mosque. So typically in the courtyard, it might be open air, it might be have a roof on it. Again, it really depends on the mosque and the regional style. And usually in this courtyard area, there is an ablution fountain or wudu area. So this is where worshipers will basically come and wash their hands and feet before entering the hallowed ground. There's sometimes even a place for you to store your shoes so that when you're walking in the holy space, you're barefoot. So the interior area where prayer happens is called the haram. In the haram, you will have a minbar, which is basically like a pulpit. This is where the imam sits and speaks to the congregation. And then there's also, very importantly, the mihrab. So the mihrab is this niche in the wall that is empty. It doesn't lead anywhere. Like, it's not like a passageway that's going in any particular like secret whatever. It is a niche that is pointing towards the direction of Mecca. So you'll recall that there is one of these pillars of Islam, Salah, where you're offering prayer 5 times a day. So wherever you are in the world, when a Muslim prays, they pray towards Mecca, right here. So the mihrab is this handy dandy kind of compass that is pointing the worshiper in the direction of Mecca. So typically the mihrab is very highly ornamented and beautiful. There will be lots of calligraphy and script and ornamentation around this area. It's usually pretty obvious when you walk into a mosque where the mihrab is. The wall that the mihrab is situated in is called the Qibla wall. Oftentimes mosques will have minarets around them. So this minaret right here, it's pencil shaped. When we get into Mughal architecture like we see in India, you're going to see minarets that have kind of like this more turnip shape to them. But we're going to see that next unit. So minarets are these towers where you will have a person go up and they will basically chant and call people to prayer, basically saying it's prayer time. So these words that are highlighted are ones that you should remember and understand for the AP exam at the very least. Okay? So also a clarification on pedentives and squinches. This rarely comes up in the AP curriculum, and it's always very difficult for me to explain exactly what these things are. So here is an illustrative diagram. Basically, they're similar in that there's some sort of foundation for a dome. So domes are very prevalent in Islamic architecture. You'll see them in mosques all the time, so just keep this in mind. So our first work in this unit is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, also called La Mesquita. So La Mesquita was actually built over a church, and that church was itself built over a pagan temple. So it was a pagan temple first, and then it was a church, and then it was a mosque, and then after the Christians reconquered Spain, it turned back into a church. So we have a similar history with buildings like the Hagia Sophia as well. In these hot commodity locations, you're oftentimes seeing these world religions come in, and they're like, this is a church, but I want it to be a mosque. It's a mosque now. So this is something that's happening in a lot of our AP artworks, particularly our architecture, is that people are coming in and they're retrofitting it to fit their purposes. So there's now a cathedral here, and this was actually a minaret, so one of these towers that called people to prayer. It is now actually a bell tower. So the bell tower is similar to the function of the minaret in that it's calling people to prayer and signaling important events in the day, but instead of a dude that is chanting, you have a bell. So this mosque is hypostyle, which means that there's lots of columns, and there's not really like a central focus. What you'll also notice too when you look at the interior of this mosque is that there's not really a lot of open space. This is the courtyard or san right here. You'll notice that it's open air, but when you get to the interior, there's not that much open space. So this is not really like a location where congregational worship would have happened. You'll notice that in a lot of the churches that we've covered that there's like pretty designated locations as to where the worshipers are supposed to be and where the like the clergy are supposed to be. But here there's not really an opportunity for a sermon to be held. People have to kind of be in their own locations and doing their own business because there's not really kind of like an open area for this to happen in. So the one complex dome in this work of architecture is right here. It's represented by this. This is where the mihrab is. Typically, the most elaborate and decorative parts of the mosque are going to be centered around the mihrab. So the ceilings were originally flat and made out of wood, but vaulting was added to them later after that technology was further developed. So the Great Mosque of Cordoba is particularly well known for the orchard in the courtyard area. So there's orange trees in here as well as other kinds of plants that were actually native to Saudi Arabia. So the legend was that the Caliph of the Umayyad dynasty was chilling out in Spain and he was homesick. And so he basically had plants brought over from his native homeland in Saudi Arabia and planted in the courtyard so that he could feel more at home. So to this day, there's still an orchard and lots of plants maintained here. So a couple of other parts of La Mesquita. This is the exterior right here. You'll notice that this arch right here is horseshoe shaped. So instead of forming like a parabola and just going kind of like wide at the end, you'll notice that it kind of goes in. So this is very typical of Visigothic architecture. So the Visigoths were in charge of this area prior to the Umayyad dynasty. So you're seeing, again, a lot of these traditions from older civilizations and older cultures that are influencing the art and architecture that is being introduced to this area. You'll also notice that there's calligraphy script that is inscribed. It's a little bit difficult to see in this image, but a lot of times you'll see in this kind of artwork there's going to be calligraphy or this written script that is passages from the Quran. In the interior here, this is what the hypostyle hall looks like. So you'll notice that the columns are spaced pretty closely together, but that the ceiling is quite high because of these double arches that are being used. So these double arches are one of the famous features of La Mesquita. You'll also notice that the voussoirs here, so voussoirs again are these alternating stones that are forming the arches, are different colors. They alternate between like a beige color, like a light beige, and this like burnt sienna color. So this is a fairly typical design motif that is seen in Islamic architecture or Islamic inspired architecture. You'll also see that there's some columns on the inside. So these were, as you guessed, taken from Roman buildings that had been in this location before. They are an example of spolia. Here's a couple of other views of La Mesquita. Here is an example of the calligraphy on the walls. So you'll notice too that when you're looking at these images that they're composed out of tiles. So these are mosaics. So there's a lot of cross-cultural stuff that is happening with mosaics. They're not just used by Christians in Christian art. You're also seeing them used in Islamic art as well. So this is the mihrab right here. This is the niche that points towards Mecca, and this is the elaborate dome above it right here. Moving on. So this is an example of secular artwork from medieval Islam. So this is a pyxis, which is basically a fancy name for a perfume jar. So it's called the Pyxis of Al-Mughira because that is who it was basically given to. There's this very convenient inscription around the base of the lid right here that basically says, this is a Pyxis and it is for this person. So this is like an art historian's dream to have the context literally embedded in the surface of the artwork. Interesting fact. So this item is made out of ivory. So ivory is a substance that is naturally produced by elephants and rhinoceroses and a couple of other animals in their tusks. So it is a very, very highly sought after material and unfortunately has led to population declines in these animals because it is such a valuable material. So because of the way that it is sourced, you can't get like a massive chunk of ivory. So this item is only 5 inches in diameter. So from here to here is 5 inches. So it's incredibly small for how detailed it is. So it's really quite a remarkable piece of art, especially with the level of detail. So in addition to this calligraphy inscription around the base right here that is telling us what it is, there are these images that are engraved into the surface, a lot of which correlate to kind of like this lifestyle that princes in the caliphate would have enjoyed. So there's scenes of hunting and wrestling and horseback riding. So these are all activities that basically what like Muslim quote-unquote royalty would have been able to enjoy. In addition, this was a container for aromatics or perfume, something that is typically like a hot commodity that is reserved for the social elite, which is again kind of reflecting its purpose. So whenever we see a lot of these figures jam-packed into a composition and there's no empty space, not really any negative space and everything's kind of like pushed in together, this is called horror vacui. So horror vacui, we talked about a little bit last unit with the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus, it means literally fear of emptiness. So the entire object is adorned, there's no empty space. We're going to see this a lot when we talk about medieval Western Christian art as well. So you'll notice that there are figures on this image. So this is pretty unusual in Islamic art, but again, because this is a more secular object and that it was not intended for use in a mosque, it's more likely that you would see figurative images here. Moving on, so this is Alhambra. So another building in Spain. So this is from the Nasrid dynasty. So Alhambra is actually an abbreviation for Cal at Alhambra, which translates to Red Fort. I love these names, they're very straightforward. So this was this massive fortified palatial complex for the Nasrid sultans. You'll notice that it's at an elevated height right here, so there's a strategic advantage to the location of this building. It's a lot more difficult to infiltrate things at higher ground because you can kind of see everything around you. So modern-day Granada is basically the southern region of Spain. The Nasrid sultans had control over this area for quite a bit of time. It was eventually repurposed to become the royal court of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, shortly after the Christians reconquered Spain. So you might recognize these names when you talk about Christopher Columbus. They are basically the two people who funded his voyage across the Atlantic Ocean and to the Americas. So this complex was extremely lavishly outfitted and decorated. It really was fit for the royalty that were intended to reside there, and it is no surprise that Ferdinand and Isabella appreciated the workmanship and lavishness of it enough to continue living there, even after they had taken over the city again. So there's a couple of different kind of resort-like accommodations in this complex. There's pools, gardens, fountains, courtyards, and 3 separate palaces. So these concentric circles represent fountains right here, and then these linear elements right here are actually pathways of water. So the fountains would oftentimes have these continue along these grooves in the floor. So the fountains had a decorative purpose, but they also had this intention of circulating the air. So fountains were very common, especially in these areas that were very hot, because it would basically cool down the room. So this is medieval air conditioning. There's also a lot of sculpting and like stucco work that you noticed in the creation of the walls of this building. So, for example, in the Hall of the Sisters, you see this incredibly detailed bracketing in the ceiling here and in the walls. So this is all hand carved. It's incredibly detailed and intricate. It would have taken hundreds, if not thousands of hours of work, incredibly expensive to fund this sort of thing. You would not have seen this level of detail in any place other than a mosque or a palatial complex. So again, you're noticing that even though this is like a palace, you're still not seeing that many like images of humans, if rather there's none at all in this complex. There are a couple of lions in the Court of the Lions here, but this is basically the only example of kind of like more like sentient animals being represented here. So we see this bracketing pattern being used similarly in the Hall of the Sisters, there, or in the Court of the Lions. There's lots of these very thin columns that are supporting this roof right here. All right, moving on to our fourth artwork. So you're probably looking at this piece and you're like, isn't that the Hagia Sophia? Basically, the architect that created this mosque, Sinan, was told by Suleiman, who commissioned the building, to basically like make the Hagia Sophia, but make it bigger and better. Oh, sorry, it was commissioned by Selim II. All right, so we have this large dome surrounded by lots of smaller domes and these 4 pencil minarets that are flanking the center. So this is a centrally planned building, very similar to the Hagia Sophia, except there's a much larger like complex that is surrounding the prayer hall. So in addition to this prayer hall, this main building of the church, we also have a courtyard, which is something that is very typical that we see in a mosque. And each of these circles here is representing a dome. This is the fountain right here. There's also a couple of other things that are surrounding the Mosque of Selim. We have these complexes right here, as well as a row of shops. So there were actually libraries and hospitals that were part of this complex right here. It was really like an urban center where you could worship, you could shop, and then you could also learn. Here is the interior of the prayer hall right here. You'll notice this beautifully ornamented ceiling. Again, we're seeing a lot of similarities to Hagia Sophia in that we have this massive dome surrounded by these smaller windows. In this image, you're seeing calligraphy in these little medallions here going around the center, as well as here. So again, we're not really seeing images of people or animals. It's mostly focusing on like plant-like motifs and imagery and calligraphy. So calligraphy is extremely important in Islamic art because it is transmitting literally the word of God. So I will go into this when we talk about this next semester, but there is a tradition in Islamic art to represent the word of God in this extremely elaborate and ornamented way that basically indicates how important it is. It's also in this very hierarchically large and tall location, which is indicating its importance. And again, we have these alternating colors on the voussoirs, which are pretty typical in Islamic architecture.